In the name of God, holy eternal majesty, holy incarnate word, and holy abiding presence. Amen. If you've lived in Chicago for a while, you probably know the name Abner Mikva. He was a politician, an attorney, a federal judge, and a law professor. Originally from Wisconsin, he moved to Chicago as a young man to start law school. And when he got here, he decided that he would like to get involved in politics. Back in Wisconsin, he remembered, if you walked by the party headquarters slowly enough, you could be party chairman before the evening was over. Well, this was Chicago. It was 1948. And he stopped by the ward headquarters in the neighborhood where he lived. A sign out front said, Timothy O'Sullivan, Ward Committeeman. So he walked in and said he'd like to volunteer to work for the Adlai Stevenson campaign. As Mikva tells it, this quintessential Chicago Ward Committeeman took the cigar out of his mouth and glared at me and said, "Who sent you, kid?" I said, "Nobody sent me." He put the cigar back in his mouth and said, "We don't want nobody that nobody sent." That was Abner Mikva's introduction to Chicago politics. You need to have connections. In our reading today from the Hebrew Scriptures, Moses figures that Pharaoh and the people of Israel would be just like that Chicago Ward Committeeman. We don't want nobody that nobody sent. When God speaks to Moses, giving him a mission to return to Egypt, to bring God's people out of slavery, Moses recognizes the gravity, the life-threatening gravity of what God is sending him to do. So Moses has questions. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring your people out of Egypt? And he knows that the Israelites are going to have questions too. Who sent you? When I say the God of your ancestors, they're going to ask, what is this God's name? Pharaoh and the Israelites and Moses himself are going to want to know who sent Moses. We don't want nobody that nobody sent. The story is well known to those who've spent time in church, or maybe who've seen the Cecil B. DeMille movie, The Ten Commandments. A little historical background. Joseph, the son of Jacob and Rachel, had been sold into slavery in Egypt. And during a time of famine, he rose to become one of the most powerful and trusted persons under Pharaoh, helping to run the whole country. When the brothers who had sold Joseph into slavery came looking for help during the famine, he forgave them and he took them in. Years rolled by. Things eventually got much worse for the Hebrews. The book of Exodus begins with these chilling words. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. This new Pharaoh decided that he had an immigration problem. He was worried that these Israelite people were growing in number and becoming a threat to his realm. So he gave an order to kill all the newborn Israelite males. What is it about tyrannical rulers and children? So when Moses is born, he's rescued from this death decree of Pharaoh. His sister cleverly hides him in a papyrus basket, and she floats the basket among the bulrushes on the bank of the river. As expected, the baby is discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, who takes him in and raises him as her own in Pharaoh's household. So Moses is an incognito Israelite, living the life of Egyptian royalty. One day when he grows up, he witnesses an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own kinsmen. And in a moment of rage, he kills the Egyptian. Realizing that he would likely be found out and charged with murder, he escapes to the land of Midian. There he marries and takes up the quiet life of a shepherd. He has a nice life, wife, family, good livelihood, much better than all the drama and danger back in Egypt. As idyllic as his life must have been, Moses must have been continually scanning the horizon just in case some Egyptian bounty hunters were coming to get him. Well, eventually the Pharaoh grows old and dies, and Exodus tells us that the Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Moreover, we're told that their cry for help rose up to God, who remembers the covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. God takes notice of their suffering and their oppression. One day, Moses is tending his flock out in the wilderness, minding his own business. He comes to a mountain called Horeb, which is also known as Sinai in the scriptures. There he happens to see a bush that was burning but was not burned up. A perpetually burning bush. And there was an angel in the flame. And then God calls out to Moses from the bush and Moses says, "Here I am." God instructs Moses to take off his sandals because he's standing on holy ground. Moses learns who it is that's speaking to him. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. The bush that burns but does not burn up may remind us of the menorah, the seven-branched lampstand that Moses later set up in the portable sanctuary in the wilderness, and later was placed in the Jerusalem temple. The lamps of the tree-like menorah were to burn continually, an eternal flame representing the eternal presence of God. In church, we also light candles as a sign of God's presence with us. Moses, standing shoeless on holy ground before the bush that burns but never burns up, finds himself in church, or if you prefer, in the temple of God, in a place where God is most fully present. But notice that this temple where Moses encounters God is way out in the wilderness, where Moses is isolated, far from his own people. God seeks Moses out. That's how God works. God seeks us out, even when we're in some remote, isolated, lonely place. A lonely, secluded spot where we're all alone can become a temple, a sacred space, a place of encounter, if we're open to it. Exodus tells us that God has observed the misery of the people and heard their cry on account of their taskmasters, and that God knows their suffering. This God is less interested in the divine right of kings or the divine right of pharaohs than with the plight of poor people who are on the underside of power. This God is relational, in relationship with Israel, in relationship with creation, in relationship with members of the human community. When the people cry out, God remembers the covenant that had been established with the ancestors, with Abraham and Sarah, with Isaac and Rebekah, with Jacob and Rachel. So God recruits Moses to take up the daunting task of returning to Egypt, confronting Pharaoh, and leading the Israelite people out of slavery and toward their new home, the Promised Land. This is an unsettling God, and Moses needs to be convinced. Moses realizes that if he's going to be successful, and he's pretty convinced that he won't be successful, but if he's going to be successful, he needs to know God's name. Pharaoh and the Hebrew slaves and Moses himself don't want nobody that nobody sent. So God gives Moses an answer. I am who I am. God says, you shall tell the Israelites, I am sent you. Tell them the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. For many years, I used to invite my friend Rabbi Bruce Elder to speak to my class on faith and service that I taught in the School of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern. One time, Rabbi Elder was speaking about Jewish perspectives on community service, and he abruptly asked the class if they knew how God's name is pronounced. Very often, the name of God is represented in Hebrew scriptures with 4 letters, YHWH. The vowels are left out of written Hebrew. Written Hebrew in the Bible has only consonants. One of the students who had been to Hebrew school said he thought the name of God in the Bible was Adonai, which means master or Lord. Since God's name cannot be uttered aloud, the name Adonai is substituted for YHWH. Rabbi Elder pointed out that when you use the vowels of Adonai, you get something like Yahovah or Jehovah, as some older versions of the Bible had it. But Rabbi Elder said that's probably the wrong pronunciation. Some modern scholars will say that the pronunciation should be something like Yahweh. But Rabbi Elder said that was probably not what the earliest writers had in mind. Instead, he said the name of God should be pronounced something like Yahweh. God is as close to us as the breath we breathe, the breath that we breathe in and out. The name of God is like a sigh. At the beginning of the book of Exodus, we are told that the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God, literally the breath of God, moved over the face of the waters. That was the beginning of creation, the making of a new world. And you may remember that in the Gospel of John, the risen Jesus appears to those fearful disciples. John says that Jesus breathed on them, giving them the Holy Spirit, the divine presence that would sustain them and spur them on. Perhaps Jesus was invoking the name of God, the God who lures us into a surprising future, a future that is built not on anything we have done, not on any merit that we've earned, but on God's sheer mercy and unconditional love and gracious forgiveness. The breath of God also is what enlivens human beings. There's a saying from one of the early church patriarchs, Saint Irenaeus: "The glory of God is a human being fully alive." To be fully alive is to plunge into the promise of God, to plunge into the future that God promises. So the name that God gives Moses is I am, or I am who I am. God's name is not a noun, it's a verb, as if to say, I will be who I will be. God is not a static or fixed being among other beings. God is free to be who God will be. God's name is a pledge to remain faithful to a promise, to remain faithful to a covenant. This is a God who disturbs and uproots, who shakes things up. This is an unsettling God. We may live in covenant with this God, but we can never possess this God or compel God to do our bidding. We cannot limit God in any way. This God has an agenda, which is to establish a kingdom unlike any other kingdom, a kingdom of justice and of love. To encounter such a God is to stand on holy ground and be enlisted in God's program to change the world by acting on behalf of those who are oppressed and excluded and downtrodden. Those Jesus would call the least of these, my brothers and sisters. So God calls Moses to get back to Egypt. There Moses will become a disruptor of the status quo, a liberator of the enslaved, and a leader of a wandering tribe who will spend the next 40 years in the wilderness before they finally enter the promised land that God provides for them. Those liberated people would complain and gripe the whole way there. Like a family on a road trip vacation, they were the kids in the back seat, repeatedly asking, "Are we there yet? When are we going to get there? How long do we have to wander in this wilderness? We want to get back to normal. We want to go home." Moses himself died before getting to the promised land. The people mourned him briefly, and then they went on without him.